Deep in the depths of the American countryside stood an ancient church surrounded by dense forest and clouds of mysterious history. This church had witnessed many events, but one event remained forgotten in the shadows of time, until one day it was time for it to unravel. In the early 19th century, when the village was still in its infancy, the church was a place of fellowship and hope for the entire community. Sunday services brought residents together for prayer and singing, and the priest, Father Jonathan, was considered a respected and good spiritual shepherd. However, as time passed, strange and terrible events began to occur at the church that changed the lives of everyone who ever crossed its threshold. At first, signs of unexplained events began to appear during the night prayer services. Sudden shadows began to loom on the walls of the church like living creatures dancing in the candlelight. Frightened parishioners began to notice that their prayers were sometimes interrupted by strange and terrifying whispers, as if voices from the world of the dead. But the worst happened one dark night when the church fell into deep darkness. The candlelight went out, and only the light of the month filtered through the windows, illuminating the altar. The villagers looked at the altar with horror, for some dark, distorted figure had appeared on it, as if it were the personification of evil. Father Jonathan prayed desperately, but his words seemed muffled by distorted sounds, and the horror in the eyes of his parishioners only increased. Then, as if out of nowhere, a slow and somber melody began, and the room was filled with the smell of rotting flesh. The villagers began to panic and ran out of the church, leaving only the desperately praying priest alone with the inhuman menace. From then on, the villagers avoided the church and told terrifying stories of hearing whispers and seeing dark figures following them out of the woods. Father Jonathan never reappeared, and his fate remained a mystery. For years, the church stood empty and abandoned until one day a group of paranormal investigators arrived, ready to solve the mystery that haunted the place. The leader of the group was Thomas Richards, known for his daring paranormal investigations. He assembled a team of experts, including a medium, a photographer, and a researcher of ancient artifacts. They arrived in the village determined to uncover the mystery of the church. The first few days of research went smoothly, but soon strange symptoms began to appear. Each member of the group began to see nightmarish visions and hear terrifying whispers that seemed to come from the very depths of the church. The medium began to fall into a trance and draw horrifying pictures depicting dark forces trying to break into our world. With each passing day, the tension in the group grew, and the study participants began to quarrel among themselves, accusing each other of attracting evil. But none of them could explain what was really going on in the church. They soon realized that they had fallen into a deadly trap and decided to leave the place. However, the attempt to leave the village was unsuccessful. They wandered through the forest but somehow always came back to the church, as if it had moved through space and time. They realized that the church did not want their secret to be revealed, and they were now prisoners of their own fear. With each passing day, the group of explorers lost hope and reason. They began to see the ghosts of their own fears and nightmares, and reality began to dissolve into an abyss of madness. They felt dark forces entering their minds and souls trying to consume them. Eventually, the group of explorers disappeared, and their fate remained unknown. The church stood alone, doomed to eternal darkness and suffering. The legend of the terrible story in the church lived in the minds of the villagers, and no one dared to enter its holy walls. And so, the story of the ancient church in America remained not only forgotten, but cursed. Its terrible secrets and dark forces awaited the next vain explorer, willing to risk everything to uncover the truth. But whatever knowledge he gains, the price he pays will prove more terrifying than the sheer terror that lurks in the dark corners of this abandoned church. Deep in the dense forest of the American countryside stood an ancient church, surrounded by a mysterious atmosphere and enigmatic legends. It was a place where the spiritual and the mystical intertwined in a marvelous way, but no one could have guessed that it was here that a terrible story would unfold that would shake their lives. In the small village that lay next to this church lived a young woman named Eliza. She was quiet and mysterious, and not much was known about her past. Her son, little Jake, was the only source of joy in her life. They lived in an old house just a short walk from the church. At first glance, the church seemed beautiful and gracious, but as night fell over the forest, it became ominous and gloomy. The villagers avoided the place after sunset, and their conversations were filled with rumors and prejudices about the church and what might lurk within. One day, as evening began to fall, Eliza decided to walk with Jake along the cliff where she could admire the church and village from above. The wood was plunged into deep darkness, and only pale stars lit their way. Jake, clinging to his mother's hand, ran and laughed happily, finding himself in serene ignorance of what awaited them. As they neared the cliff, Eliza suddenly felt some strange presence. She noticed someone standing at the top of the cliff in the distance, framed by a pale light. She cautiously pulled Jake to her and froze, looking up at the figure. "Who is it?" she whispered, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. The figure slowly descended the cliff and approached them. Eliza was horrified to recognize the figure as a woman who had died long ago. It was her mother, a living memory in her mind. "Mother? This is impossible," whispered Eliza, scarcely believing her eyes. "My daughter, you summoned me." Her mother's voice sounded soft and gentle, but there was a strangely cold tone to it. Eliza felt fear squeeze her heart. She realized that this meeting was something unreal, something from the world of the dead, but at the same time she couldn't take her eyes off that figure. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Elise whispered, her voice trembling. "You must find the key to unlocking the past. Hidden inside the church are ancient scrolls that will reveal the true nature of that terrible night. If you do not solve this mystery, your son will be in danger." Eliza felt her mind exploding with internal conflict. She wanted to believe her mother, but she could not rely on such cryptic words. On the other hand, she saw real concern and fear in her mother's eyes. "I don't understand how I can solve the mysteries of the past. I'm just an ordinary woman," Eliza said, trying to grasp the meaning of what was being said. "You are not just an ordinary woman, my daughter. There is something special about you that is connected to this church. You must free her from the curse." Her mother's voice became more insistent. Eliza felt a tremendous weight of responsibility resting on her. She looked at her son, who, despite the strangeness of the situation, looked at them with his clear eyes. She realized that she would have to risk everything to protect her son and uncover the secret of the church. "All right, I'll do it. But how do I get started? Where do I look for these scrolls?" Eliza asked, trying to figure out where to begin her journey. "Look for the key to the past inside the church. Start at the altar. There is an ancient book there that hides the answers to all questions," replied the mother, her figure beginning to dissolve into darkness. Eliza realized that she needed to act quickly. She took Jake's hand and ran toward the church where the mysterious figure had pointed. The night was cold and gloomy, but they didn't stop. As soon as they entered the church, Elise felt a strange sensation, as if she had entered another world. She slowly approached the altar where an old book lay on an ancient stand. She opened it and began to read. Strange symbols and rituals began to reveal to her a story that seemed unbelievable. When Eliza learned that many years ago, a brutal sacrifice had taken place in this church, where an innocent woman was sacrificed to dark forces to achieve immortality, she realized that this was the beginning of this whole mystical story. Dark forces had placed a curse on the church, and it had been a place of evil and fear ever since. Eliza felt it was now her duty to break that curse. She studied all the scrolls she found in the church and discovered a way to break the curse and save her son. But it required a sacrifice. She herself had to do battle with dark forces and sacrifice her life to protect Jake's future. Through the night battle and the darkness of the church, Eliza fought evil using knowledge from ancient scrolls. Her strength and determination against the darkness was incredible. In the end, she was able to break the curse, but the price was high. Her own life was sacrificed. The dark forces that had held this church in power for years were gone, and peace returned to the village. Eliza became a heroine and a legend, her story passed from mouth to mouth, and her courage and devotion memorable days. But in the evenings, when the moon shone brightly and the church stood out in the night gloom, the villagers still felt the strange atmosphere and mystery that lurked within its walls. The legend of the girl who saved her son and broke the curse remained alive in their hearts, reminding them how the power of faith and love can overcome even the worst evil. In a quiet and cozy American village, immersed in a world of lush nature and serene surroundings, stood an ancient church surrounded by century-old trees and tangled paths. It was believed that in this place the spiritual and the mystical were intertwined, creating a special aura of mystery and mystery. But no one could have guessed that it was here that a terrible story would unfold that would turn one family's life upside down. The Morgan family lived in this village. Father Thomas, Mother Elizabeth, and their 2 children, Emma and Jake. The family had lived in the house across from the church for generations, and to them this place was not only home, but a part of their history. Father Thomas was a respected local man and worked as a small store owner. Mother Elizabeth did volunteer work, and the children attended the local school. But one day, on the day of the fall equinox, strange and unexplained events began to happen. At night, while the family slept, mysterious sounds began to echo in the house, banging on the walls, quiet rustles, and unexplained whispers. Father Thomas tried to come to reason and explain these sounds rationally. Perhaps they were drafts or electrical problems. But the longer these strange occurrences went on, the more frantic their nature became. The Morgan family decided to go to the church service and talk to the local priest, Father John, hoping for his help. He was a kind and tolerant man, always willing to listen to the problems of his parishioners. They told him about all the strange events that had been happening in their home. Father John looked worried, but at the same time he said that perhaps it was just the result of fatigue and nervous tension. A few nights later, however, events took an even more horrific turn. The family awoke to total darkness in the house, even though there was a bright moon outside. The electricity had failed, and they found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. The room was filled with eerie screams and moans that seemed to come from everywhere. The children began to cry, and the parents were at a complete loss. They tried to run outside, but the front doors were locked from the inside, as if someone or something wanted to keep them inside. They spent the night terrified, listening to those inhuman sounds and feeling fear and despair engulf them. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the room, they were finally able to get out of the house. The family was in shock, and they decided to leave the house, even though it had been a part of their lives for many years. The Morgan family found temporary shelter with relatives in another city and told them about the terrifying events that had happened to them. They contacted paranormal experts who investigated the case in their home. The frightening truth began to reveal itself to them. It turned out that the church across the street from their home carried a terrible past. Years ago, it had been the site of macabre rituals and sacrifices conducted by a dark cult. These obscurantists vowed to return and take over those living near the church to continue their dark deeds. The Morgan family finds themselves in the middle of this mystical battle between good and evil. To save their family and village, they had to fight the dark forces that wanted to take over their lives. They infiltrated inside the church, where they found an ancient scroll with a spell that could end the cult. However, the ritual was not easy. They faced unseen forces, their minds filled with visions of horror and fear. But the Morgan family was persistent and determined, and through their strength of faith and love for each other, they were able to destroy the dark forces and free the church from evil. From then on, life in the village began to recover. Elizabeth and Thomas became symbols of hope and strength to their neighbors, and Emma and Jake continued their studies and classes despite everything they had been through. The church was cleaned up and once again became a place of spiritual and national affection. The Morgan family remained in this village, forever connected to it and its history. Their story has become a legend passed down from generation to generation, reminding everyone how the power of family bonding and faith can overcome even the worst dark forces.